I used to believe what they told us about the moon. I used to believe what they told us about physics, about progress, about why we were really going back. And then Artemis II happened, and I started asking questions that no one wanted to answer. My name is Professor Victor Blackwell. I spent 15 years inside the American academic system teaching what I now know to be only half-truths, carefully curated illusions designed to keep you docile, distracted, and dreaming. Before I say another word, I need you to do something for me. Subscribe to this channel, like this video, not because I want numbers, because there are things I still cannot reveal yet. And when I do, this content will not survive long on these platforms. They have already begun scrubbing the trail. Artemis III is being sold to you as humanity's next great leap, but if you believe the narrative they built around Artemis II, you have already been conditioned to accept the lie. I am going to show you why the mathematics do not align, why the physics they parade on television contradicts what I saw in classified briefings, and why the same institutions that silenced me are now preparing you for another performance. Stay with me. The next 20 minutes will change the way you look at the sky. I was not always the man speaking to you now. There was a time when I stood in lecture halls at one of the most respected institutions in the United States, chalk in hand, explaining orbital mechanics to students who trusted me because I wore the title they had been taught to revere. I believed the equations. I believed the textbooks. I believed that science was a cathedral built on proof, peer review, and the slow, honest accumulation of truth. But belief is a fragile architecture when you begin to notice the cracks. It started with small things, details that would not have disturbed a casual observer, but that gnawed at me because I had been trained to see patterns. A published result that contradicted an earlier finding, quietly retracted without explanation. A colleague who stopped answering emails after presenting a paper on lunar radiation anomalies at a closed conference in Houston. A funding stream that shifted overnight from pure research to narrative-driven projects, all of them carrying the same polished language about national pride, human destiny, and the inevitability of our return to the moon. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself that institutions evolve, that priorities change, that science must sometimes serve politics because that is simply how the world works. But the contradictions accumulated faster than I could rationalize them. The media would announce a breakthrough, and I would open the original study to find that the data had been massaged, spun, or in some cases entirely absent from the public record. Academic journals that once demanded rigor began publishing conclusions that violated basic principles I had taught for years, and when I raised questions in faculty meetings, I was met with silence, then with warnings, then with the slow, surgical removal of my influence. Courses reassigned, committees closed to me, invitations that stopped arriving. They did not fire me. That would have created a record, a story, a possibility that someone might ask why. Instead, they isolated me, starved me of access, made it clear that my presence was tolerated only so long as I remained invisible. And in that isolation, I began to see the architecture of the system itself. It was not incompetence. It was not coincidence. It was design. The same design that shaped Artemis II into a spectacle of hope while concealing the data that mattered. The same design that is now preparing you for Artemis III with speeches about courage and exploration, when the truth is far more disturbing and far more controlled than any astronaut will ever say on camera. I am no longer inside that system. I am outside it, looking in, and what I see is a machine that does not want you to understand what is really happening above our atmosphere. What follows is not speculation. It is what I witnessed, what I documented, and what I was instructed never to discuss. The breaking point did not arrive with a thunderclap. It came in the form of a manila folder left on my desk in the physics department at 3 in the morning, when the building was supposed to be empty, and the security cameras, I later confirmed, had been looped to show an empty corridor for exactly 17 minutes. Inside that folder were printouts of telemetry data from Artemis II, raw streams that had never been released to the public, and a handwritten note that read only, "Check the thermal signatures against the official narrative." I spent the next 48 hours in my home office, cross-referencing the numbers with published reports, with the press releases that NASA had distributed to every major network, with the triumphant footage of astronauts speaking to the president from lunar orbit. What I found was not a single glaring lie, but a constellation of small, precise deceptions, each one invisible to the untrained eye but collectively devastating. The thermal signatures showed heat dissipation patterns that were inconsistent with the spacecraft configuration described in the mission parameters. The radiation readings, which should have spiked during the translunar injection phase according to every model I had ever taught, remained suspiciously flat, as if the data had been smoothed by an algorithm designed to reassure rather than inform. And the orbital mechanics, the very bread and butter of my professional life, contained adjustments that had no basis in any known gravitational model. Adjustments that were explained away in the official documentation as navigation corrections, but that I recognized after days of analysis as compensations for something the mission was not publicly acknowledging. I did not sleep during those 2 days. I drank coffee until my hands shook, and then I drank more, because the pattern was emerging, and once you see a pattern you cannot unsee it, and I understood that what I was looking at was not a failed experiment or a technical anomaly, but a deliberate reconstruction of reality. A version of the mission that had been built for consumption, while the real mission, whatever it was, had occurred behind a curtain of classification. I tried to contact the colleague who had left the folder, but his office was empty, his phone disconnected, his name removed from the university directory within 72 hours. When I asked the department chair about him, I was told he had taken a position in the private sector and wished to sever all academic ties. The explanation was delivered with a flatness that I now recognize as the sound of a system closing ranks. I made the mistake of presenting my findings at a small symposium on advanced propulsion, a gathering of perhaps 30 researchers in a hotel conference room in Baltimore. I did not mention the folder. I spoke only about the published data, the inconsistencies any competent physicist could verify, the questions that should have been asked by the journalists who had breathlessly covered the mission as if it were a sporting event. The room was silent when I finished. Not the silence of intellectual engagement, but the silence of people who have just heard something they are afraid to acknowledge. One man, a senior researcher from a federally funded laboratory, approached me afterward and said, very quietly, that I was making people uncomfortable and that discomfort had consequences in the current funding environment. I asked him if he thought the data was wrong. He looked at me for a long moment and said, "I think the data is whatever it needs to be." That sentence haunted me for months, because it was not an admission of ignorance. It was a description of policy. I began to dig deeper, not into the physics alone, but into the structure of the programs themselves, the funding pipelines, the congressional committees, the defense contractors whose logos appeared in the backgrounds of press conferences with the subtlety of wallpaper. Artemis II had been billed as a test of the Orion spacecraft and the Space Launch System, a stepping stone toward the lunar surface landing promised by Artemis III. But the budget allocations told a different story. The money was flowing into technologies that had no clear application to lunar exploration, into research on closed-loop life support systems rated for durations far exceeding a short orbital mission, into materials science projects focused on shielding against radiation types not native to the lunar environment but common in deep space. I started attending conferences I was not invited to, sitting in the back rows of presentations where contractors discussed capabilities that had no place in a public lunar program. I spoke to engineers who had worked on components that never appeared in the official schematics, who described testing regimes in facilities that did not exist on any public map. They spoke in the coded language of people who know they are being watched, who have learned to hide meaning inside technical banality. One of them, after several drinks at a hotel bar in Cocoa Beach, told me that the real question was not whether we could return to the moon, but whether the moon was where we were actually going. He laughed when he said it, but his eyes did not laugh. And when I pressed him, he changed the subject so smoothly that I knew the deflection had been rehearsed. I returned to my data with a new urgency. I began to map the personnel movements, the sudden retirements of experienced mission controllers, the promotions of younger administrators with backgrounds in information management rather than engineering. I traced the publication histories of scientists who had once been vocal critics of lunar exploration timelines and who had, after Artemis II, fallen silent or reversed their positions without publishing new research to justify the change. The pattern was not limited to NASA. The European Space Agency, which had contributed service modules to the Orion program, had quietly reclassified certain technical documents. The Japanese Aerospace Exploration Agency had delayed its own lunar initiatives without public explanation. Even private contractors, normally eager to publicize every contract win, had begun operating under layers of non-disclosure agreements so thick that their own employees did not know what they were building. I was no longer observing a space program. I was observing a coordination mechanism, a system of synchronized silence that required the participation of thousands of people who each knew only their small piece of the puzzle and who had been incentivized, through grants, clearances, career advancement, or the simple fear of professional extinction, to never ask what the puzzle depicted. I tried to publish a paper. Not the folder, not the classified data, but a straightforward analysis of the public inconsistencies in the Artemis II thermal and radiation reports, written in the dry, careful language of academic physics, every claim footnoted, every equation verified by colleagues who still spoke to me. The journal accepted it for peer review. 3 weeks later, I received a rejection letter citing concerns about potential misinterpretation by non-specialist audiences and the sensitivity of topics related to national space initiatives. I had been publishing for 15 years, and I had never encountered a rejection rationale that referenced public relations. I appealed to the editor, who had once been a friendly acquaintance, and he told me over the phone, his voice strained, that the decision had come from higher up, that there had been a conversation, that it would be better for everyone if I focused on theoretical work rather than mission analysis. I asked who had called him. He said he could not tell me, and the way he said it made clear that the caller had not needed to identify themselves because their authority was understood. That was the moment I understood that I was not dealing with scientific disagreement or institutional caution. I was dealing with something that operated like a government but was not entirely governmental, something that used the machinery of science and journalism and education to produce a consensus that served interests never disclosed to the public. The physics professor who had trusted equations and evidence was dead. In his place stood a man who understood that the most powerful force in human affairs is not gravity or electromagnetism, but the controlled distribution of information, the ability to make millions of people believe they are witnessing progress when they are actually witnessing theater. Artemis II was not a mission failure in any conventional sense. The hardware performed, the astronauts returned, the public cheered. But it was a narrative failure for those of us who looked at the underlying data, because the narrative required us to believe that what we were seeing was the whole story, and I knew, with the certainty that comes from sleepless nights and abandoned friendships, that we had been shown only the stage, never the machinery behind it. And now they are preparing Artemis III, and the machinery is running again, and the same voices are promising us the moon, while the budgets and the personnel movements and the classified documents tell a story that has nothing to do with exploration and everything to do with something older, larger, and far more controlled than any astronaut will ever admit while wearing that suit and smiling for the cameras. I did not arrive at this understanding gradually. There was a specific night, in the winter after Artemis II, when I sat in my basement surrounded by documents and realized that the inconsistencies were not flaws to be hidden, but features of the design itself. The system was not failing to tell the truth. It was engineered to replace truth with a more manageable substitute. Every press release, every staged video call from orbit, every patriotic speech about returning to the moon was a load-bearing wall in a structure built to keep us looking up while something else happened sideways, out of frame. I understood then that Artemis III would not correct Artemis II's omissions. It would fulfill them, the next act in a sequence where the audience believes they are watching history when they are actually watching choreography designed by people who view humanity not as explorers but as a manageable variable in an equation we are not permitted to see. The physics I had devoted my life to was still real, still immutable, but it had been removed from public discourse and replaced with a ceremonial science, a theater of equations performed for cameras, while the actual calculations happened in rooms without windows. I saw myself clearly for the first time in that basement. I had been a priest in a church that preached curiosity while practicing control, and my defection was not brave but inevitable, the natural consequence of seeing the scaffolding behind the miracle. The awakening was not liberating. It was devastating, because once you see the architecture, you see it everywhere. In the synchronized messaging of news networks, in the sudden consensus among academics who should disagree, in the way dissent is never punished openly, but simply made irrelevant through obscurity and institutional indifference. They do not need to silence everyone. They only need to make the truth unthinkable, and they have succeeded for decades. Artemis III is not about the moon. It is about your willingness to believe that the moon is all they are after. That willingness is the product of a machinery so vast and so patient that questioning it feels, to most people, like questioning gravity itself. But gravity is real, and so is the machine. I have seen both, and I'm no longer capable of pretending otherwise. I am not asking you to storm any building or reject every institution you have ever trusted. I am asking you to look at Artemis III with the same eyes you would use to examine any claim that arrives wrapped in flags and applause. Ask why the budgets do not match the stated mission parameters. Ask why the personnel who built Artemis II have vanished from public view, while new faces, trained in narrative management rather than propulsion, now occupy the briefing rooms. Ask why the physics that governs every other domain of your life suddenly becomes flexible and opaque when it enters the theater of space exploration. I have given you what I can without placing you in the same crosshairs that now define my existence. There are documents I still possess that I cannot yet release, names I cannot yet speak, coordinates that I have verified but that I will not disclose until I am certain the disclosure will survive the first hour. The system is not omnipotent. It is patient, well-funded, and deeply practiced at making the truth feel like madness. But it is also fragile in ways its architects do not advertise, because it depends entirely on your willingness to stop asking. I stopped asking once, and I spent 15 years teaching comfortable lies in a comfortable room. I will not do it again. Artemis III will launch, or it will be delayed, or it will be rebranded under another name that carries the same synthetic optimism. Whatever form it takes, remember that the moon is still there, indifferent to our narratives, governed by laws that do not bend for press conferences. And somewhere in the gap between that real moon and the one they are selling you, the truth is waiting. I intend to keep looking. I suggest you do the same. Subscribe. Stay close. The next transmission may not come from this channel.